Hello, class. 4 more years. I am not a crook. You probably have no idea who this is.
This is actually a very popular mask of the 37th president of the United States, Richard Nixon. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He was president when I was born, and he had been president for a while. So you probably have no idea who he is. He was the 37th president of the United States. Earlier in our class, I had referenced a quote. I think it was week one by former President Gerald Ford, who was the 38th president. And paraphrased him saying, my fellow Americans are, well, I paraphrased him. What he said was, my fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is finally over. Now, part of the reason he said that was because he was the 30th president, because he was the vice president to this fellow, Richard Milhous Nixon, who was the first and thus far only president to ever resign. And so you may wonder sometimes, and maybe you already know this, but anytime there's a scandal, we typically add the word gate to it. So when the New England Patriots got caught stealing signals, allegedly, using a camera at a game at the Meadowlands versus the hated New York Jets, they called it Spy Gate. When the New England Patriots were accused of deflating balls in the AFC Championship game, they called it Deflate Gate. Typically, whenever there's a scandal, we add the word gate to it. Now, you probably always wondered why, or maybe you didn't wonder why, or you just didn't even notice, but the reason is because of Richard Nixon. So, why am I telling you all this? Other than this fact that I'm a frustrated history professor, it's because I wanted to add something to the professionalism module about ethics and maybe character. So Richard Nixon actually was vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower and almost got bumped off the ticket because of the Checkers scandal, where it was alleged that he had accepted all kinds of suspicious gifts from donors, which can be an ethical landmine and a public relations nightmare if you're a candidate. But then he went and gave the famous Checkers speech when he talked about the only thing he had accepted was the family dog Checkers, and his kids loved the dog too much, and he wasn't going to give the dog back. And that speech was enough for him to stay on the vice presidential ticket. Um, so the reason we had a gate is because of something called Watergate. And that was a scandal that came about in the 1970s. Now, after having been vice president of the United States, Richard Nixon ran for president in 1960. He didn't win. He lost to Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy. So John F. Kennedy, who is an interesting fellow, he has become lionized in American history because he was 35th president and many people were dramatically impacted by his assassination. And it was, you're probably too young to have been aware of it at the time. It was that generation's 9/11 moment. I'm wondering what yours would be. Yours is probably COVID, right? Everyone knows where they were when the first lockdowns went in and you had to stop going out in public without a mask on, and when you had to be on the hunt for toilet paper at all costs. Um, for the earlier generation, it would have been 9/11, that tragic day. For my parents' generation, it was really the Kennedy assassination. And so from that came a lot of things, including a creation of a mythology about what the Kennedy presidency had really been. Don't get me wrong, he was a bit of a rock star, but he was hardly what I would call a successful president. His legislative agenda was stalled in Congress. He almost led the world into a nuclear apocalypse during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were a lot of reasons to wonder if, he was going to be a very strong candidate for reelection. I know election denying has a bit of a bad connotation today, but there were genuine irregularities in the 1960 election that led some to go to then the then vice president say, you might have a case that they didn't win because of irregularities. I believe it was Chicago, St. Louis, and Texas, that the returns in those states were in doubt. Of course, Chicago had the infamous Daley machine in Chicago. St. Louis was also a very well-run machine. And his vice presidential candidate, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was nicknamed Landslide Lindy because in his first congressional election, he got elected by a very small number of votes that may or may not have been real votes. And so Lyndon Johnson had for years enjoyed curious electoral success in Texas. So when approached on that, Nixon said, well, no, I'm not going to do that to the country. I'm not going to, deny the election. If he had, it wouldn't have been the first time. There was actually the infamous election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tindon in the 19th century, where it was alleged that the outcome of the election was the result of a backroom deal between Rutherford B. Hayes, who, amongst his opponents, gained the nickname Rutherford Hayes, had agreed to end Reconstruction in the South in order to be president. But Nixon said he didn't want to do that to the country. He goes and he runs for governor of California, and he loses. And accounts are mixed, but in some accounts I hear he may have had a little bit too much to drink, and goes down to give his campaign farewell address and concede defeat and says,
You're not going to have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore.
and it was a speech that everyone said that was it for him. He just ruined his whole career and it was over. Well, then the 1968 election came, and it was a very tumultuous time in our history. We had Vietnam. Jay, what does this have to do with professionalism? I'm getting there. Wait for it. You're not required to watch this video. You can turn it off at any time. But because of it, Lyndon Baines Johnson is very unpopular, and his vice president, so the sitting president, who can run for re-election, comes in first, but not by a lot, in the New Hampshire primary, and it's an embarrassment, and he decides not to run. And so his vice president feels like he has to walk a very fine line between supporting the president and speaking out against the very unpopular Vietnam War. And meanwhile, the peace movement, which is kind of floundering in 1968, has a huge rally that wasn't as huge as it was supposed to be outside the Democratic National Committee. And ultimately, the Daily Machine makes sure that they're beaten. Unfortunately, a lot of it ends up on television, network television. And when Nixon runs, he runs as the law and order candidate who's going to put an end to all of that nonsense and restore American values and all that good stuff. And then in 1972, he runs for re-election and wins in a landslide. I think he only fails to carry Massachusetts, oddly enough. And yet he has to resign several years later. Well, a story comes out in the press that the Watergate Hotel, and that's where the gate comes from, the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., which is the headquarters for the Democratic National Committee, has been burglarized, and they caught the burglars. Well, it turns out the burglars are bankrolled by CREEP, which, believe it or not, is an acronym for the Committee to Re-elect the President, which, if you're picking your acronyms, that might not be the way you want to go. But there's some intense characters who are, arrested. There's G. Gordon Liddy. There's, some interesting characters. Ultimately, the president is accused of lying about Watergate and what he knew and when he knew it. And because of the perception that he had lied, a perception backed up by tapes, turns out he was taping everything that was said in the White House and on the phone in the White House. He lost support. Articles of impeachment were being crafted. This was a much bigger deal than it was then than it is today, where, it seems like we have articles of impeachment every other week or so. And he realized he probably lost his support and wasn't going to be able to win. So what happens is you get impeached by the House of Representatives, and then the case is tried by the Senate. And he didn't have the votes, and so he knew that he was going to get removed from office, and so he resigned for something that today the Supreme Court probably would argue he would not have been able to be held accountable for because of their most recent ruling regarding the Trump presidency. Furthermore, President Bill Clinton in the late 90s was impeached for lying to Congress and ended up surviving that impeachment. Bill Clinton wasn't the first president impeached. That was Andrew Johnson, who was president after Lincoln was assassinated. I don't know if we're seeing a trend here, right? Get the job because you were assassinated. And well, actually, Johnson got the job because he was assassinated. But my point being that your president gets assassinated, actually, that's not true because of Teddy Roosevelt, but we won't go down there rabbit hole. Anyway, my point is that what got him in trouble, Nixon, that is, wasn't that he broke into the Watergate Hotel. He did not do that. People who worked for his reelection campaign did that. What got him in trouble was the cover-up. And so you've probably heard the expression that it's not so much what you did, it's the cover-up. And so say you accidentally overwrite the first quiz in a particular class you're the instructor for, you've got some options. You could own it, send out an email saying, hey, I screwed up. I don't know how I did it, but I did it, and take corrective action. Or you can try to cover it up. And if you cover it up, unless you get caught covering it up. So the cover-up's always worse than usually the incident. So interestingly enough, when we're talking about ethics, right? So the reason I bring all this up is because in your career, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to have some humdingers out there where you're like, oof, I'm probably not sleeping tonight because this one's bad. But how you respond to those moments might be something that would have been in President John F. Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage. And Profiles in Courage, right, is a book that actually won an award and has resulted in the Profile in Courage Award. It won the esteemed Pulitzer Prize Award. You may remember that another member of the Kennedy White House, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who I mentioned to you, won 2 of those. Well, John F. Kennedy won one for Profiles in Courage, where he went through and studied different leaders and figures who had heroic moments and showcased great courage. Here's the fun fact. Kennedy probably didn't write that book. In fact, I'm pretty sure he didn't write the book. It was Ted Sorensen, who is a ghostwriter on the work. And so he only won the Pulitzer because of a very strong campaign to win the Pulitzer. It's kind of like winning a Nobel Prize without actually having done anything yet. Not that that's ever happened in this country. It's a Swedish award, but you know what I'm saying. So, or maybe you don't. But there's some ethical questions about John F. Kennedy. You know, did he even write Profiles in Courage, which he accepted a Pulitzer Prize for? His personal life. Enough has been written and shared about that. So we have to ask ourselves that question. In the 1970s, which is an era that I'm particularly interested in, the Ford Motor Company began to realize that it was losing market share to overseas, this may sound familiar, overseas competitors in what was then West Germany, because there were 2 Germanys, but that's a whole nother rabbit hole that we don't have time to get into, and Japan. And in particular, Japan and West Germany had pioneered a new type of car called an economy car. And it just so happened that right around the time we were starting to experience oil shocks. And so, in part because of support of Israel in various wars. And so the OPEC nations, the oil producing nations, started creating boycotts and cutting production of oil. And so the cost of oil had gone up, something that we didn't even really worry about for years. It would be like, what would be comparable today that we wouldn't really even think would be expensive and wouldn't expect it to be expensive? Years ago, I could read the entire Boston Globe online for free. And they put up a paywall about 10 years later. And like, I wasn't going to pay for it now. I'd enjoyed it for free for so many years. It was kind of like that. And it really was a shock to the American consumer. And it was a cause of inflation. And so these cars really benefited because part of the benefit of the economy car is that it runs more efficiently. You get more miles per gallon because it's smaller. It also costs less money to purchase. So if your money's being strained a little bit by increases in the cost of gas, then maybe you'll go with this smaller car. And so President of Ford, Lee Iacocca, came out with an order. We were going to have a car that weighed less than 2,000 pounds, cost less than $2,000, and would be done in 24 months, even though the typical tooling, I don't have to get too deep into that, even though the typical tooling for that type of car, for any car at that time in the industry was 36 months. So it would be like a year faster or so. And so his designers had their marching orders. They got the car. It was going to be less than $2,000. It was going to weigh less than 2,000 pounds. All the machine tools for making it were going to be in place in 2 years. There's only one problem with the car. If you happen to get hit from behind at a speed in excess of 20 miles per hour, the gas tank would dislodge from the car, empty its contents over anyone in the car, And the gas tank had studs on the end of it that when they struck asphalt tended to spark, creating an inferno inside the cabin. Initially, it also had a problem where it would stall randomly sometimes on the highway once you pulled off the interstate. So now I know, right? Most of us never get our car even close to 20 miles per hour. So it's probably a very safe speed. So Ford had a decision to make. They could have either stopped production, fixed it, or they realized that for a small amount of money, I've seen different cost estimates, somewhere between $7 and $15 a car. They could put this little baffle bladder thing in there that would protect those inside the car from getting incinerated. And you know, kind of hold that gas tank where it needs to stay. Depending on the version of the story that you read, and I'm just going to keep it basic because I'm already probably way over time here, but the company was aware that the National Traffic and Safety Administration had a estimate on what the cost of a human life was for their statistical analysis. And so they did a cost benefit analysis to determine that it would be cheaper to pay off the victims' families who died in the car than it would be to pay for this extra part that would go from somewhere between $7 and $15 a car. And that was the decision they made. And the Pinto, which was marketed under the phrase, Pinto gives you that warm feeling, had drivers and passengers who had terrible, terrible fiery deaths. It became known as the ashtray that seats five. You put a fifth person in there. 3 girls in Indiana filled up their gas tank and went on a highway that didn't happen to have a shoulder. And they'd filled the tank and suddenly realized that the gas cap was on top of the roof. So they pulled over. Unfortunately, a gentleman who worked at a van conversion business, they would take a 70s van and trip it out to be kind of like a cross between a nightclub and a spare bedroom. It was the 70s. So it was a weird time. And he was smoking, probably not a cigarette, having to drop it and look down to pick it back up. It was traveling at a very high rate of speed. And again, there was no shoulder. So when the girls pulled over to get the gas cap, they were still in the roadway. And he never saw them. He slammed into them. The Pinto became a inferno. 2 of the girls died. They were the lucky ones. One lived until later at the hospital. And 3rd-degree burns, terrible, terrible thing. Just terrible way to die. The state of Indiana put Ford Motor on trial for murder. They beat the rap, but the publicity wasn't great. And eventually Ford Motor had the largest, at that time, the largest ever recall in the history of the United States auto industry, and lost millions of dollars and lost millions of dollars in sales. And so if you go on YouTube and you put in Ford Pinto, you can actually see the crash tests they did because there's old footage of it. And now that is what's known as a classic business ethics example. And so it's murky because others will say there actually was no safe economy car that you could rear end at 20 miles or more an hour and expect to walk away from. In fact, there is no safe car. The only safe car would be way too expensive to mass produce. You'd never be able to afford it. One of the engineers who worked on the design of the car actually bought one and drove it to work every day. So it's a tough case if you look at it. But let me ask you the question. If you were in charge of that product, would you have continued on with production of that car and sold it? The answer to that question should always be in the back of your mind when you find yourself in an ethical dilemma when you're at work. Maybe you're going to be an SLPA. Maybe you're going to be a social worker. There's a lot of ethical stuff that could come up. Depending on your career, like those two, you'll be a mandated reporter. What if a kid comes in and he's got bruises all over his arm? Should you report that? You're a mandated reporter. You've got to make a decision. Hopefully, you're saying, well, that's not a decision. I have to report it. Whenever I've used that example in classes before, I've always asked for a vote, would you make the car or not? And generally, no one agrees to make the car. I've had maybe 3 students in that time agree to make the car. And I couldn't fault their logic. It wasn't a right or wrong question in my mind, necessarily. I mean, me personally, I don't think I could have lived with myself if I made the car. My mom had a Ford Pinto, but we had the wagon, the station wagon. So that one wasn't prone to fiery death. It wasn't a very good car, right? But it wasn't as likely to burst into a fiery inferno. So, I mean, you take what you can there, I guess. But similarly, and I'm using a lot of automotive, which is interesting because I'm not a car guy. I don't even change my own oil. So when I'm threatening that I'm going to dump my used motor oil into the earth because I hate environmentalism, I'm lying. Oh, ethics. Ethics workshop. Because I don't even change my oil. They end up recycling it for me. Which global warming for me means beachfront property, right? Because I live in Wilbraham, and if the temperature goes up too high and the ice caps melt, I'll be living in the Wilbrahamas with beachfront property. So I'm kidding. Am I? But sticking with automotive examples, several years ago, the Volkswagen Corporation got in trouble because they were falsifying emissions reports. They had some sort of program in their car computers that would give it a clean emission, or relatively whatever the standard emission was, when in fact their cars were not up to standard for emissions. Similarly, Toyota was just about ready to take over as the largest automotive manufacturer in the world when they covered up a problem with their Takata airbags and avoided a recall for a long time until they got into a lot of trouble for that. And so, again, it's not necessarily the problem. If you take accountability, own the problem, correct the problem, there's not a problem, or there's not as big a problem. But the cover-up is what gets you into trouble. So, and I include Volkswagen in that because they covered up the fact that their car wasn't wasn't meeting the emission standards that they had to meet. So when you're thinking about your career, you're going to have those ethical questions, and hopefully you make the right ethical decision. One of the pillars of Elms College is that we really like to promote ethical leadership. So you do the right thing even when people aren't looking. You do the right thing even if you're probably not going to get caught. You make a mistake, you own it. And so hopefully some of that is permeating to you through the courses you're taking. Again, this is not a mandatory one, and I just wanted to put another dimension to this entire professionalism issue. But if professionalism is doing the right thing when no one's looking, that requires ethics. Some would say it involves character. I feel like that's an overused word, but we're actually going for a grant on character, so I'm going to say that very softly. So let me leave you with this. What would you have done? Would you have built the car? Or would you have not built the car? If you need extra credit for this course, tell you what I'm going to do. If you email me a 2-page document on what you would have decided to do and why, 2 pages, I'll give you extra credit. And there we have it. I'm actually, I'll leave with this. I'll close with this. I'm actually, Richard Nixon's one of my favorite presidents. And to this day, I feel like he got a little bit of a bum rap because another way, a less popular way, a very minority opinion, a minority report opinion, is that Watergate was really an attempt to overturn his landslide victory in the 1972 presidential election. That is not the consensus opinion. It may or may not be my opinion, but it's sure fun to talk about. And that's one of the things I love about history. So thank you. And if you watched, thanks for sitting through all that.